Welcome back to the Pulse and Perspective. I am your host, Pete D'Angelo, with your weekly mortgage market update. We have a little bit to talk about today. The Fed said exactly what we expected. They did not move their interest rates. We are still seeing that the Federal Reserve is remaining cautious because they don't want to stoke the flames of inflation. So what did Fed Chair Jerome Powell communicate yesterday? First and foremost, they kept their policy rate the same. It's currently at 4.25% to 4.5%, and the forward-looking comments are that they're going to still remain dependent on the data, particularly when they look at inflation and the labor market. Powell's messaging emphasized patience. They are taking a patient approach because they do not want to put themselves in a position where they lower their policy rate and then inflation ramps back up, especially because tariffs are still this variable that's part of the equation that is having an impact. Based on Fed Chair Jerome Powell's responses to reporters yesterday when he held his press conference, it was a little bit of a mixed signaling because they don't know what the tangible impacts are and how much they can weigh the data that they look at compared to the headlines of what's been going on with tariffs and the impact it's going to be having and maybe has had on inflation and GDP, the overall health of the economy. There's a very important part about what happened yesterday, something historic that hasn't happened since 1993. There was dissent among the Fed governors. As I mentioned last week, the Federal Reserve is comprised of a number of members, and they sit at the table to discuss the decision-making on the policy. Well, two of the Fed governors were in favor of a 0.25% decrease on the Fed fund rate. This is the first time that that's happened since 1993. There is a dissident, to quote Pearl Jam. Dissidence here is an indication that I will now insert a little bit more of my opinion than I normally do. If we rewind the clock to last year, the last Fed meeting in July, they kept their policy rate the same. They don't meet in August, so that means that their next meeting is September. That means possibly two data reports for the labor market and some inflation reports. We may get two in that gap. And based upon what Fed Chair Jerome Powell says in the conference like last year, the market is going to anticipate what they're going to do. And that's what created a different rate environment last year, not what the Fed actually did. What happened last year? We received a report from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics that they had made a miscalculation on the jobs numbers. We're talking about job openings, labor turnover. They overestimated 880,000 jobs over a 12-month period from 2023 to 2024. The market reaction was, whoa, let's put this into perspective. The Federal Reserve has mentioned that they're looking very intently at how the job market is, and that the job market looks stable, so they didn't have a reason to cut their policy rate. When that revision hit, everyone expected interest rates to come down and maybe come down a little more quickly. In August, we had one of the best rate environments that we saw in 2024. The Fed didn't say a word. They were not meeting. That's when we had our lowest interest rates. My perspective now, learning from that. Now putting that into context here, I think two of our Fed governors may be wanting to have the opportunity to say, I told you so, because there could be softening in the labor market. They have to remain dependent on data, and the quality of that data is getting a little bit more difficult to determine because so much is changing in this ever-changing world right now. And some of the more legacy data providers and surveys may not be giving us as accurate of a representation as they used to in the past. So with that said, two Fed governors, they happen to have been appointed by the current administration in Washington. They are in favor of 0.25% cuts. However, the consensus was still that they're keeping the policy rate the same, so it is staying the same for now. This will be very important for us to take a look at when we get into September, and also when we take a look at how the market changes possibly over the next couple weeks and into August. With that being said, there's some important data that is going to be provided immediately after the Fed met this past Wednesday. First and foremost, this Friday, we're going to have a jobs report. They talked about labor a lot in the conference, and when Fed Chair Jerome Powell was responding to reporters and held his press conference after the meeting, that is going to be part of the calculus here. Also, we're going to have an inflation report within the next week. We're going to get the personal consumption expenditure. The personal consumption expenditure isn't just any inflation gauge. It is the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. So we're going to have to see what that looks like. Where are they at right now? They're averaging between 6.7 and 6.9% based upon a number of data sources available to us today. With that, there was a little bit of a dip, but then the rates came up a little bit after the Fed meeting and some of the comments from Jerome Powell. We're staying range bound. We're still staying underneath 7%, which is nice. But we've really been keeping interest rates for the most part this year within 0.25%, maybe 0.3% throughout the whole year. However, we are seeing currently some of the lowest interest rates that we've seen this year. So we are on the low end of where 30-year fixed rate mortgages have been this year with respect to the Fed and this data that's going to be coming out. I want to remind everyone about what happened last year beyond what we just reviewed. After the Fed did meet in September, for the next 3 meetings, they cut their policy rate. They came out swinging with a 0.5% cut, and then the 2 subsequent meetings, they had a 0.25%, totaling 1% lower, which is where we have arrived and where we've been at 4.25 to 4.5% for the Fed fund rate. Need to bust the myth. The Fed fund rate does not actually set the stage, and that is 100% correlated to 30-year mortgage rates. It is part of the consideration. It does support what is going to happen for mortgage rates, but it is not exclusive, mutually exclusive. In that time where we saw 1% reduction on the Fed fund rate, we did see mortgage rates go up about 0.5%. Counterintuitive, you may say, yes, but the market is speculative. It is not basing it 100% on what is happening now. People are going to be paying mortgages back for a prescribed amount of time into the future. So it's anticipatory. When we start getting the data over the next month and a half until we see the next Fed meeting, we're going to have the market reacting to the data points with a little bit more sensitivity. And then we have to also compound that by the realistic approach that the market is being run by algorithms for the most part in the summertime. This is customary. Ever since technology's reached the level that it has, we have been noticing that there are little swings in the market that become big swings because algorithms are programmed a specific way. When considering larger swaths of data, especially considering that you have AI available now and larger data sets are able to be analyzed and interpreted very quickly. So these systems are getting more complex, but what it is doing is when someone's not actively engaged at the wheel and we're on autopilot, well, autopilot can make decisions one way or the other that can otherwise maybe wouldn't have been a big swing, could be. So over the past 2 years, this has been a good time to see interest rates come down. And right now, I'm going to tell you this. If the labor starts to show cooling, which it already kind of did this week, we did see a miss on one of the labor reports that showed less job openings than was expected, and that shows softening. We need to see trends for the Fed to do anything because they're going to continue to remain cautious here, but that's important for us. And if we see that consistent for the next 2 months, you're going to have lower interest rates. How much lower remains to be seen, but it is possible we have an opportunity within the next 45 days for us to break the floor of where the lowest interest rates have been this year going into September. So we'll be keeping an eye out for that. I may do a special episode, a little breaking news, if I start seeing that, because I want you to be able to take advantage of that if it does occur. More commentary on mortgage applications right now. They did see a 9.7% increase week over week. Because of that little bit of improvement and also the summertime squarely here in July, families planning to move, they want to do it before the school year starts. Historically, this is a common time where we see a little bit of a bump up. I think that was exacerbated by a slightly improved interest rate environment over the past couple weeks. Looking out a little bit further on the mortgage rates, Fannie Mae expects by the end of 2025 for interest rates to land somewhere in the 6.4% range. It's not going to be into the fives, barring something coming out of left field. I always like to say that. We can't make hard and fast projections while the market is speculating so much and there's so much that's up in the air. We're in unprecedented times. It's important to make note of that. This isn't a, quote, normal market. This is a market that is heavily dependent on the interest rate policies of a government's Federal Reserve, the U.S. That's not how a market freely operates. So these are the things that we need to keep an eye on. And also, with respect to mortgage rates, I've had some conversations over the past week, and I think it bears repeating. I do not believe mortgage rates are going to get into the fours and even the low fives in the near future unless something comes out of left field and happens to roil the market where the Federal Reserve, maybe for an emergency purpose, needs to lower interest rates, or there's a flight to safety and a lot of money moves from the stock market into the bond market. When the bond market yields go down, that's when we see mortgage rates also go down. Those are the scenarios that would create an environment of lower interest rates. But as it stands, if the situation remains this normal and hectic, we're not going to see interest rates reduce much further than I think where Fannie Mae is saying, around 6.4%. Now moving on to take a look at the real estate market. Not much has happened, but one of the important things to note, looking at the whole nation, we are seeing an increase in inventory. Inventory is up 17% year over year right now. The sales trend is higher, but even though we're seeing a 17% increase year over year, 1 in 3 homes are dropping their prices. That is an indication of market change and market correction. That means sellers had a higher expectation for what their home would sell for, and they have to temper that. They actually have to lower their price in order to entice buyers. This is a national look. Zooming into New Jersey, this is happening in some markets. It's not happening across the whole state, but it is still developing in some markets, and it's happening in more markets as time goes on, but it's slower. The rest of the country is giving us an indication. But here in New Jersey and also in ultra-competitive markets, that is remaining the same. So it's staying consistent. It's still competitive in New Jersey. You still have to kind of give it your all, but it's no longer a case where, even for me in assisting the families that I do, I'm not thinking anymore about, oh yeah, you definitely got to go 10% over list price if you want to be competitive, or 5%. I leave that conversation to the trusted, amazing real estate professionals that I work with. Buyers want to pick my brain, and I make sure that they understand I don't want to overstep. I defer to your agent on this. But my opinion, based on what I see, we don't have to be swinging for the fences with every offer, but it is dependent on what market you're shopping in. There are some markets that are still extremely competitive. So that's our look, and that's our update for this week. I hope you found this information helpful and useful. Keep an eye out for Monday's mortgage update. We're going to take a look at temporary buydowns versus permanent buydowns. We know that interest rates have not been providing affordability opportunity for us, so how can we create that affordability opportunity now? And especially when we look at the rest of the country and we see there's a softening happening and home prices are being reduced. Let's talk. Now that you're a buyer that may have some leverage in your negotiating with a seller, let's make sure that you get the most out of that so that you can be effective and realize the most savings. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and take good care.